everyone, and welcome back. As I do historical research, I come across a lot of antiquated terms, and most recently I keep coming across the term mannish. And this is a particularly popular term from around the 1890s through the 1920s and even into the 1940s, but in the early part of that range, they like to refer to mannish women, not a woman who is mannish, not mannish fashions and mannish styles, but specifically as if an organized group exists of mannish women with a known appearance and hobbies and styling and attitudes. And it got me really curious because much of what I was seeing seems to be the same problems that are still being presented today. That women are wearing far too masculine of clothing, they're wearing actual men's clothing, they're doing more men's things than they should be doing, and it falls down to very often getting stereotyped as a feminist who hates men or as a butch lesbian if women are appearing to be more masculine. So I was curious as to whether or not this was the same way that they were viewing it back in the 1890s, well through the 1920s, when mannish women seemed to be at a point of being considered a craze as well as a concern. So I wanted to wander through and see what references I could find, see what descriptions I could find, and quite frankly, this is going to be a really amusing journey. First up, the older versions of mannish seem to be referring more to women that specifically wore men's clothing. This is just scattered about references. It's not talking about a group so much as just occasionally a woman who wears clothing that is actually men's clothing or more styled like it. But once we reach the 1860s, I start to find more references. Article in 1868 goes into pretty good detail about what mannish women looked like, and they talk about them as a fairly organized concept. Firstly, they wear men's clothing like shirts, vests, and ties, but they also sit, move, and speak like men. They cross their legs and sit in more comfortable positions rather than appropriate ones for women. They use their whole hands rather than their fingertips. They also enjoy their dogs and their horses more than they enjoy children. They prefer cheese and beer over sweets and wine, and enjoy participating in men's hobbies like carpentry, which I don't know about you, but I feel a little bit called out right now. They do state that this is more of an affectation. They don't think these actions and this appearance is how women actually present from the inside, but instead they are mimicking men and putting it on as a sort of a performance. It doesn't seem to be too broad of an issue though, because it only comes up occasionally until we reach the 1880s. As of the late portion of that decade, women start wearing a lot more tailored clothing, and it starts coming up much more often. An 1887 article says that it's actually chic for women to be masculine, though it seems to be particularly popular with other women more so than with men, which I'm not going to read any more into that than what it says, but the irony is not lost. And particularly, these women are driving really large horse carts through the streets of town at aggressive speeds. They seem to be handling things well, so it just is giving a lot of confusion to the men and startling them quite a bit, more so than actually creating a problem. One poem from 1889 describes the mannish woman in pretty good detail, saying, "She wore a mannish little coat with knowing little pockets. She's cast aside her necklaces, her bangles, and her lockets. Her dicky collar and cravat exactly match her brother's. Her round straw hat is so like his, you can't tell one from t'others. She ventures on a little slang that sounds quite brusque and mannish, but show her once a mouse or worm and see the disguise vanish." So again, stating these women are putting on the clothing and the mannerisms of men, but deep down, they're still a woman, and they're still going to act in womanish ways. But with the addition of masculine fashions becoming more than just wearing men's clothing and becoming the fashionable choice of the decade, things start changing pretty rapidly. By 1887, mannish is being used as a descriptor for different styles being sold. It's not a negative term so much as it's just the description, much like we might say something is tailored. So it's not always inherently a negative thing at this point in time, and in fact it is very much a fashion trend. There is a craze for the mannish, as one article claims, and they state that soon women will have 20 pockets, creased pants, but they'll also be smoking and have loose language. You can therefore technically wear the more tailored clothing without actually acting mannish. The two should apparently remain separated because once you embrace the mannish activities, you can no longer get respect as a woman. And plenty of women started picking up these mannish styles without wanting to participate in the mannish lifestyle. One 1902 article interviews a stenographer who self-describes as wearing mannish clothing and being a mannish woman, but she says that she wears these clothes simply for practicality. She works in a job that requires her to walk outside pretty often, and the weather is not always great, so she wants to make sure that she is comfortable at work and in her job, that she has an easier time getting dressed in the morning, and that it's much more practical in terms of both cost and time for her. So wearing mannish styles is not meant to be revolutionary in her mindset. And in fact, this article, which is a fairly large one with lots of images, specifically touches upon women wearing trousers and the potential of that future, and the fact that some women even do as of that point, but saying women all over the world wear trousers, and it's not a big deal there, so why does it need to be a big deal now, here? But to many it is a very big deal. This is also the era in the 1890s where women are really taking on riding bicycles. So suddenly there is this whole new activity and freedom. They're also picking up sports, and they're creating all of these different clubs and spaces for women to actually be physically active. So the bicycle is seen as potentially questionable very quickly because it's giving women freedom and independence, and potentially that comes along with a lot of new notions. This particular article is actually put out by a women's rescue league who claims that a whole lot of the women that come to their rescue are bicycle women and mannish women, and that essentially they will fall into disrepute and need assistance. So clearly there's already a line being drawn directly between the counterculture movement, that is women doing more masculine things, and the downfall of womankind. And this is the era on top of things like bicycles where women's rights and suffrage and all sorts of questions about women being potentially equal with men in different areas really, really take off. And a lot of times the images that are being painted of this suffrage movement isn't so much a positive one as much as it is just women acting like men and doing all of the negative things that men do. Of course, it's not men that simply need to fix these negative things, it's if women gain the same freedoms as men, they too will take up all of these sorts of vices, smoking and drinking. They'll stop caring about their children. The woman here clearly wants nothing to do with them. They're checking on stocks and gambling and doing all of the things that are considered relatively inappropriate and just barely tolerable when men do them, but this image, which actually is out of Puck magazine, is showcasing just how much of a downfall the world will be if women simply gain some rights and start acting a bit more like men. And one of the other things that springs out of this time period is specifically called the New Woman. And she seems to run hand in hand along with the Mannish Woman. There's not a complete overlap between the two. There are plenty of New Women who still dress in fairly feminine styles, and there are plenty of Mannish women who are doing so out of practicality rather than wanting to participate in the movement that is the New Woman. But it is really well personified by this particular photograph. And this is a self-portrait by Frances Benjamin Johnston, and she, in it, describes herself as a new woman, and she is shown smoking, crossing her legs, and showing her petticoats, and just generally sitting in a very laissez-faire attitude. She's not only exemplifying this through that singular portrait, but also her entire lifestyle. She did come from a family of decent means to begin with, but she utilized this to become a photographer, and a rather famous photographer at that. So she went around photographing really important people of the day, as well as photographing workers and their conditions, photographing architecture and around different areas of cities and America. So she has a huge quantity of relatively famous photographs that she has published during her life and beyond. She, therefore, is an independent woman who is supporting herself and going out there and doing things that she thinks women should be able to do, and not everyone does. She was very supportive about women getting into photography. She also never married. She had a long-term partner, Maddie Edwards Hewitt, and they lived together for a very long time, and it's well known now that they had a romantic relationship. So she takes the concept of the New Woman even further in the fact that she has proved her independence. That's exactly the sort of concern that I was looking to find in some of these situations, because they get really vocal about the concern that women will just simply start not needing men. This 1916 story, which is clearly a fictional story, is about a young woman who starts off life as a tomboy, and when she is young and dressing in more mannish styles, it's considered relatively cute, or at least spunky, and it's not a big problem. But as she ages and she has really strong opinions about independence and really negative opinions about men, she consistently chooses to not be nice to them, basically. She tells them when they're wrong and talks back to them. She wears those mannish styles and acts in mannish ways, and as she grows old and unattractive, it stops being okay and starts being a problem. She realizes suddenly that she's very lonely, that men want nothing to do with her as a romantic option, and women want nothing to do with her as a friend. And so she is left regretting her life as a mannish woman and wishing she could go back and change her own mind on that. This is the image that they're starting to paint of mannish women. They aren't even really considering that perhaps they don't have any interest in men and might just have alternatives to that. Because not only does this have the potential to steer women away from doing the things that they're supposed to be doing as women, but it also has the potential to ruin men. Because if women don't need men, what's going to happen to the men? Are they going to grow soft in the fact that they aren't needed anymore? Or are they simply going to have to pick up women's jobs? If women gain power and control, are they going to make men do all of the work that women have to do right now? Are they going to have to do the washing and take care of the children and all of those horrible things? The world might go topsy-turvy, and, well, that just would mean the end of everything. So they're presenting it by the early 1900s, what's next? How is this possibly going to get any worse? So they're now looking to things like science, and I use that term very loosely, to prove that women are in fact being permanently affected by this mannish craze, that it's not just putting on a different type of clothing or simply saying a few different words or sitting in a different way, but they are physically, scientifically changing. This one man apparently went around and took measurements of 10,000 young women and aggregated them together to find an average and created this sculpture, which they go on at length about for how mannish it is, how she's just not nearly as curvy as she should be. Now, of course, much more than 10 years ago, women were far too curvy due to corsets, and they state that too. But this new figure, this young woman that is developing with a man's body, more so and more so all the time, and where will it end? I really hope you can see the absolute humor in the fact that this is... I literally cannot see the problem at this point in time, and the whole thing is absolutely absurd. I just want to make sure that we all recognize that for one moment. But this is something that they are trying to prove, that this is more than just a moral issue, this is more than just a religious issue, this is potentially a scientific issue. Because if women on the pendulum are swinging more towards mannish, then men will also swing more towards womanish. Because even though that word doesn't get used nearly as much, it's not describing fashion, and there's not really a large movement of womanish men so much at some point in time, but it's still the concern that that will occur. Particularly when we look at World War I, moving into the late 19-teens, where women have to take over a lot of the jobs that men were doing because they're off at war, and some of them aren't coming back. So women are picking up jobs that would otherwise have been outside of the acceptable range at this point in time, encouraging them to be even more mannish in all sorts of attributes in their life. In 1923, one article says that they're wearing men's clothing, they're being physically active, they're parting their short hair on the left side, and all of this in the end will cheapen them. Again, I'm feeling really called out right now. And men aren't without blame in all of this. In fact, quite a few articles say that it is just as much the men's fault as the women's fault. That men are adopting womanish things, like apparently nice umbrellas, like the type that won't be stolen is how they define it, and I'm not sure exactly how to deal with that. This person comes up quite often talking about how men are to blame because they've become far too soft with their silk pajamas and safety razors. Because as we all know, safety is clearly womanish. And that now that women have money and can support themselves, they no longer think of marriage as the final destination, the final goal. They think of it as merely one stop along the way. And what is going to happen in the end to marriage as a concept? This is going to encourage divorce. This is going to encourage women to not get married. These womanish men are also taking part in ruining society. Of course, the counter-argument directly to this is the fact that, well, look at the 18th century. By our standards today, those men all dressed in rather womanish ways, yet no one would call George Washington or Thomas Jefferson womanish, but the mannish style fully took hold in the 1920s, though it does also somewhat contrast with the boyish style. There's plenty of arguments stating the boyish style is what's actually in, and it's meant to be more youthful and more fun and far less serious than the mannish mode, but there are plenty of women still participating throughout the 1920s in the mannish style, and interestingly enough, this fashion image is pretty directly taken from a real person. The style, the monocle, everything about it is made to look like Lady Una Trowbridge. And she was a particularly famous woman at the time who had a very distinct style. She was part of a growing community of lesbian women, and she and many of the other women in that group wore mannish styles of clothing and picked up more mannish attributes. So that group is definitely a very distinct source of the mannish woman in the 1920s, as they participated in the mannish styles and were lesbians. They were certainly far from being the only source material for it, and as they walked around wearing that sort of clothing, they would not necessarily have stood out from the rest of the public at the time. A lot of other women who weren't part of their group were participating in that fashion. So it presents itself as sort of an interesting overlap, and it continues to be that way throughout the rest of the 20th century. We look at the 1930s and the growth of shoulder pads. Those get titled as mannish once again, though that is a broad, wide-ranging fashion style, and so many women participate in it, and it's not seen as an entirely separate fashion from the regular. Instead, it is just the current fashion. Same thing goes well into the 1940s, especially with World War II and needing again to step into men's positions at jobs, and having more mannish style clothing allowed that to be easier, wearing trousers, wearing jackets and coats and shirts. And it doesn't really even stop there, even in the hyper-feminine 1950s, in through the 1960s, and especially we look at the 1980s with the power suit and the giant shoulder pads. The mannish style continues to show up in fashion over and over and over again. However, the mannish woman, everything that she was, beyond just what she wore, but how she acted and how she viewed the world and the movements that she participated in and the choices that she made, kind of sticks around to just that 1890s through the 1920s portion. And instead, the newer versions of it do come in things like butch lesbians or other counterculture movements that really center themselves around fashion being part of their communication system, being able to be recognizable by others or recognizable by the people that are not part of their group. So this early format presents us with a really interesting view on the fact that these are still things that are being complained about today. Of course, women wear fashion in general that is much more mannish than it was back in the 1890s. The clothing that is sold for women is much closer to the clothing that is sold for men today as well. Yet these are still topics that are consistently being brought up, and I can honestly say that a lot of these things could be published today and most people wouldn't realize that they are well over 100 years old.